You work for a large farm with many fields of corn. You are investigating the mass of a sample of ears of corn. You gather the following data. This represents the mass in grams of ears of corn. Some of the masses in the sample seem much larger than the rest. You decide to make several calculations describing the spread of the data set. You hope to use them to help in search for outliers. First, we're going to find the IQR interquartile range, which requires finding the first quartile and the third quartile. We will find the sample standard deviation and then apply two rules to identify outliers. The first rule is the 1.5 times the IQR. The second rule is going to be 2 standard deviation rule, which is related to the empirical rule. So here are the steps that I've got to follow. I copied my data already. I'm going to compute the mean to use it for the last part of the question. So average. I'm going to select my data. And then I'm going to compute the sample standard deviation. I'm going to compute it right here. Standard deviation dot S of the data. And then I'm going to find the quartiles. So the first quartile dot inclusive of the data, comma, the first quartile, and quartile dot inclusive of the data, comma, third quartile. The IQR is the third quartile minus the first quartile. So I found my quartiles here. Now I'm going to apply the two rules. The first rule is to find the lower limit and the lower limit and the upper limit, or the lower fence and the upper fence, is the 1.5 times IQR. I'm going to compute it here. It says I need Q1 minus 1.5 times IQR. So here's the IQR. The second one, which is the upper fence or the upper limit, says I need the Q3 plus 1.5 times IQR. So those are the upper fence and the lower fence using the 1.5 IQR. The next method is the mean minus 2 standard deviation and mean plus 2 standard deviation. This is related to the empirical rule. So we have computed the mean right here. So I'm going to say the first rule is the mean minus 2 times the standard deviation. The next one, or the upper limit, is going to be equal to the mean plus 2 times the standard deviation. So I have the numbers. As you can see here, I can determine outliers based on the numbers that I have. If I use this rule right here, this is the lower limit and this is the upper limit, meaning any number below this number is considered an outlier. Any number above the 29 is considered an outlier. If we use the first rule, which is the 1.5 IQR, we notice that the lower fence is lower than the minimum, so we don't have any numbers that are below the lower fence, so we don't have outliers. The maximum is still below the upper limit, so we don't have any outliers using this rule. But if we use the second rule, which is basically saying 95% of the data is between those two numbers, any number outside of this range is considered an outlier. If we look here, we can see that the minimum is 13, so the lower fence is lower than the minimum. We don't have outliers on the side of the minimum, on the side of the lower fence or the lower limit, but on the upper fence we do have an outlier. An outlier, namely, is the maximum 29.2. That is an outlier because it is bigger than 27, which is in this case the upper fence. So in this case, for the second measure, we do have an outlier. For the first measure, we don't have outliers there.